European history. The French Revolution of 1789. The French Revolution of 1789. A revolution refers to a fundamental or complete change that takes place in the political, social, and economic spheres of a society. A revolution can be peaceful or violent, where changes are realized through force. The French Revolution of 1789 was a violent uprising of the masses against the existing government in France. By 1789, France was under a monarchy kingdom which had ruled France for over a period of over 400 years, and because of that long period of time, the regime was referred to as the Ancient Regime. The rulers of this regime were from a family that was known as the Bourbons, and that's why the government was at times referred to as the Bourbon monarchy. Several kings served this regime, including Henry Roman IV, Louis Roman XIII, Louis Roman XIV, Louis Roman XV, and by 1789 the King of France was known as Louis Roman XVI. The French Revolution broke out on 5 May 1789 when King Louis Roman XVI summoned or called the States General, which failed. On 14 July 1789, mobs of hungry and angry people, mostly peasants, stormed Paris, which was the capital of France, and the king could not stop their violent actions. As a result, a revolution that caused fundamental changes in France had to continue for several years up to 1799. As the revolution progressed, the monarchy was abolished, and among the things, France was declared a republic in 1792 as King Louis Roman XVI, together with his wife Marie Antoinette, were executed or killed in 1793. The causes of the French Revolution of 1789. The social class system in France. The influence of the philosophers. The nature of the French system of government, ancient regime. The role of the Catholic Church. The character of King Louis Roman XVI. The influence of the Queen. The influence of England. The American War of Independence. The financial crisis or bankruptcy. The bad weather/famine. The summoning and failure of the Estates General. The social class system or struggle in France. The French Revolution of 1789 was a result of the class struggle between the privileged and unprivileged class in France. By 1789, France was a class-based society with high levels of inequality. It had three classes, also referred to as estates, and these included the first estate. This included the key members of the clergy, church leaders. The clergy were members of the Catholic Church, but were also divided into the upper bishops and archbishops and the lower clergy, priests and monks, who did much of the church work. European history. The French Revolution of 1789. The second estate. This was made up of the nobles, princes and princesses royals. The nobility was divided into the greater, lesser nobility and nobility of the robe. Nobility of the robe were adopted nobles, i.e. admitted into the noble ranks because their parents or grandparents had done great things for the state. The third estate. This comprised of the peasants and the middle-class men bourgeoisie. The first two estates were the natural leaders and most privileged in France. It was difficult to cross from one estate to another. In general, the French nobility and clergy enjoyed several privileges, ranging from political power to exemption from taxation. The middle class were denied political power, and the peasants led a life of total misery or suffering. This led to enmity between the classes, and this acted as the major force behind the French Revolution of 1789, as the third estate struggled to enjoy similar privileges. The clergy. As members of the first estate and belonging to the Catholic Church, they provided religious services in France. As a result, they used this chance to deny religious freedom to the members of other churches. This annoyed them, hence forcing them to organize a revolution in 1789. They also controlled the education system in France, and they used this position to deny education to the peasants. By 1789, the peasants rose up demanding for equality before education. The clergy owned 10% of the total land in France, and they had peasants as squatters on the land. They therefore used this privilege to demand feudal taxes from the peasants, which caused discontent among the peasants. By 1789, the clergy were exempted from paying taxes, yet they had a lot of wealth. In addition, they enjoyed costly privileges like constant parties at the King's Court Royal Palace, which drained the state treasury. This resulted into the bankruptcy of the French crown, which eventually sparked off the French Revolution of 1789. The clergy were divided into the upper and lower clergy. The upper clergy took most of the important posts in the church and were very rich. Their luxurious life angered the members of the lower clergy, who were the parish priests and suffered in poverty, who demanded for equality. They therefore joined the peasants and the middle class to revolt in 1789. The nobles. These belonged to the second estate and held high offices in the army and government at the expense of the third estate. This annoyed the peasants in France, hence forcing them to stage a revolution in 1789. The nobles were also exempted from taxation and yet lived a luxurious life at the king's court. This contributed to the bankruptcy of the French treasury, which eventually sparked off a revolution in France by 1789. They owned a lot of the land on which peasants lived and worked as serfs. Every noble left to his son either a castle or a mansion, and also a lot of territory from which he collected taxes. All this annoyed the members of the Third Estate, hence inspiring them to stage a revolution by 1789. European history: the French Revolution at 1789 and target. All this caused discontent among the members of the Third Estate, which eventually sparked off the French Revolution of 1789. Besides, the nobles were also divided. There were those that belonged to the greater nobility and those of the lesser nobility and the nobility of the robe. The greater nobility were the high-ranking officers and commanders of the French army. Therefore, there was a conflict between the greater nobility, who enjoyed all the privileges, and the lesser nobility and nobility of the robe, who enjoyed no privileges at all apart from the honored titles. The lesser nobility therefore joined the peasants to demand for social equality and justice by 1789. Finally, the nobles advised King Louis Roman XVI to call the Estates General meeting in May 1789, which was the immediate cause of the French Revolution of 1789. It was in this meeting that the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly in total defiance of the king. The nobles refused to listen to the demands of the Third Estate, who therefore opted for a revolution in 1789. The burdens of the peasants: they belonged to the Third Estate and represented the most suffering group in France. It had a population of over 22 million people, yet the members of the First and Second Estate were less than 1 million people. The peasants experienced the heaviest burden of taxation, paying several taxes like the poll tax paid to the king, a tenth of his income to the church, 12th of his income to income tax, the salt tax paid by every peasant over 7 years of age, and custom duties in each village where he passed with his goods as he took them for processing and marketing. This heavy taxation greatly annoyed the peasants, hence forcing them to stage a revolution in 1789. The peasants were subjected to the exploitative and oppressive system of feudalism. By this system, all land and wealth were owned by the nobles and clergy, and the peasants lived on this land as serfs. The feudal system of land tenure in France was unfair, and the peasants opposed it because it made most of them landless. The nobles also used to charge a lot feudal dues or taxes from the serfs. The peasants hated this system, and therefore they revolted in 1789. The peasants were restricted to move from one region to another or from one estate to another, since all the necessities of life for peasants would be provided by the landlords in every feudal village. This also annoyed them, thus inspiring them to organize a revolution in 1789. They were forced to give their labor free of charge to work on roads, farms for their landlords, and serve in the army. While they served in the army, they were discriminated because they could not be promoted. Joining the army was not voluntary for peasants, yet they were not allowed to ascend military ranks. By the military law of 1781, the law of commissioned and non-commissioned ranks, important positions and ranks in the army were to be given to nobles only. This also became a major source of discontent among the peasants. The peasants in France also suffered unfair trial. The nobles, for example, used to establish their own courts where the peasants were tried, and no peasant won a case against any member of the First and Second Estates. The peasants would also be arrested and imprisoned at the orders of the king, without trial. All this caused discontent among the peasants. Consequently, with leadership from the middle class, the desperate peasants offered themselves for the Revolution of 1789. European history: the French Revolution of 1789. Within the Third Estate were the middle class or bourgeoisie, who also belonged to the unprivileged group in the French society. It was a numerically small class consisting of professionals, the most educated people like doctors, lawyers, teachers, and the wealthy Frenchmen. They were powerful in the field of finance, trade, and industry, and from this class came ministers of state, judges, magistrates, and tax collectors. They travelled widely and therefore had a lot of intellectual and financial experience. They became discontented because they were denied certain rights enjoyed by the First and Second Estates. They hated the favoritism of the ancient regime, which denied them high positions in the government and the army despite their great education. As a result, by 1789 they wanted to have fair representation in government and the army, and this was one of their major grievances. They also called for religious freedom in France. They opposed the dominancy of the Roman Catholic Church in the religious affairs of France. By 1789, they therefore rose up to establish freedom of worship in France. They hated the dictatorship of the ancient regime. For example, they wanted a written constitution for France. This would help to reduce the uncontrolled influence of the king and his courtiers in political affairs. They also resented this strict system of censoring press, as people were not free to criticize government. Apart from the political grievances, the merchants and industrialists had economic grievances. They were unhappy about the worsening economy of France because of the excessive extravagancy by the government officials and involvement in unnecessary wars like the 7 Years' War 1756–1763 and the American War 1776–1783. These wars drained France's financial resources, thus crippling the French economy. The wealthy middle class had also lent their money to the French government during the period of bankruptcy, but by 1789 they had not been paid. There was a fear that the government would not pay back. As a result, they decided to join the peasants in organizing a revolution so to recover their money. The influence of the philosophers. The 17th century was an age of enlightenment in Europe, which gave rise to political philosophers in European countries including France. These were intellectuals or great thinkers who wrote books which contained literature, and this literature was interpreted by the educated people in France who influenced others to stage a revolution against the ancient regime. The prominent French philosophers included Voltaire, Rousseau and Montesquieu among others. Voltaire 1694–1778. He lived between 1694 and 1778. He wrote a book known as Letters on the English. In this book, he attacked the Catholic Church in France. For example, that this church did not allow religious freedom. He also criticized the presence of social classes in France and the privileges that were given to the members of the first and second estates. He also compared the system of government in England with that of France. For example, he noted that in England there was fair trial by the judicial system, yet the judicial system in France was very European history. The French Revolution of 1789 was compared to that of England by Voltaire, thus leading to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution. Montesquieu 1689–1755. His book was known as The Spirit of Laws, in which he put his views. In this book he expressed that ideas of equality, liberty and fraternity if people were to have good life on this earth. Liberty referred to freedom, equality meant equal treatment, while fraternity meant brotherhood. However, in France the three aspects were completely missing. For example, the French society was divided into estates, whereby the first two estates enjoyed more privileges than the third estate. There was no freedom, for example freedom of worship, and also the Frenchmen did not share the feeling of brotherhood. This caused discontent, and the Frenchmen therefore decided to stage a revolution demanding for liberty, equality and fraternity, and indeed the three ideas became the slogan of the French Revolution of 1789. He also suggested that for any government to be fair and efficient, functioning properly and cater for the interests of its citizens, it had to have three arms, which included the executive, legislature, parliament and judiciary. He went ahead to state that if a member of the executive interfered with the work of the legislature and the judiciary, then that ruler was likely to be autocratic or a dictator. His writings applied to France because the King of France was autocratic by 1789. For example, Louis Roman XVI did not allow a parliament in France, and he used to refer to himself as the law. The King of France could issue warrants letters to cashieres that would lead to the arrest, imprisonment and death of those suspected to be opponents of the ancient regime. This caused a lot of discontent, and therefore the Frenchmen demanded for a constitutional government, which led to the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789. Jean-Jacques Rousseau 1712–1778. He wrote a book known as The Social Contract, in which he expressed that though man is born free as ever in chains, that man was born to enjoy natural freedoms like the right to live, freedom of worship, freedom of expression, freedom of association and the right to own property, among others. But the rulers denied these rights to their people. He therefore recommended that people had to be left free to enjoy their natural rights. The philosophy ideas of Rousseau applied to France and influenced the people to stage a revolution in 1789 because the system of government of the ancient regime did not provide for freedom of worship, association as well as the right to own property. For example, the peasants were not allowed to own land and a right to life because innocent French men would be arrested, imprisoned and killed on the orders of the king. The French system of government ancient regime. By 1789, France was under a government known as the Ancient Regime. This regime was very unfair, with a lot of weaknesses which contributed to the outbreak of the revolution in the following ways. The system of government was based on hereditary leadership as a form of succession. The system of government had a weakness because the king had to come from the first estate, which comprised of the members of the royal family. As a result of this, there were incompetent or weak rulers in France, and King Louis Roman XVI was a living example because he could not manage the state affairs. This European history, the French Revolution of 1789. There was lack of a functional parliament to address people's problems in France by 1789. The Estates General, which used to act as a parliament, had lost met in 1614 and therefore had not sat for a period of 175 years. In the districts and princes, the assemblies parliaments were replaced by royal assemblies known as intendants, which were influenced by the king. Lack of a parliament meant that the French masses had no forum to air out their social political complaints as well as economic hardships. It also meant that the king had excessive powers since there was no parliament to check on his actions. This created discontent among the people, hence inspiring them to stage a revolution in 1789. There was also lack of a constitution in France. The ancient regime ruled France without a constitution to protect people's rights and equality of all opportunities. Because of this, there were no checks and balances against the king's excessive powers and unfair policies. This therefore left the king with too much power that was unquestioned. Hence, the desire to give France a constitution resulted into a revolution by 1789. The judicial system was also very unfair, which caused the French Revolution of 1789. The French judicial system lacked uniform courts of law. A person would be tried as many as 50 times for a single offence he or she committed. In fact, by 1789, there were about 400 different courts of law operating in different parts of France, which caused judicial confusion. There were also different laws operating in France, like the Roman law in the south and the common law in the north. There was also no trial by jury, fair hearing, and in most cases the nobles were the accusers and at the same time the judges against the peasants and middle-class members. Such unfairness eventually contributed to the outbreak of the revolution in 1789. There was a lot of despotism or dictatorship in France by 1789. The Bourbon monarchy was characterized by gross abuse of human rights and lack of democracy. All the powers of the government were vested in the hands of the king, who regarded himself as a demigod, a king by the grace of God and not the will of the people. In fact, the king was the law, and at one time boasted by saying the thing is legal because I wish it. King Louis Roman XVI at one time also said, "The state is myself." Such expressions showed the despotic powers that the king had over his subjects. As if that was not enough, the king's ministers had a lot of powers that could not be challenged. For example, the king and his ministers used arrest warrants known as lettres de cachette, which were empowering them to arrest and imprison anyone at any time. All this unfairness eventually forced the masses to stage a revolution in France by 1789. The system of government also promoted nepotism or favoritism in France. The administrative structure of the ancient regime by 1789 was unfair because it favored the nobles and clergy, who dominated the key positions in the army and civil service despite their incompetence and corrupt tendencies, which led to inefficiency in the administration. What was most annoying was that the middle class was highly qualified but excluded from the top administration of their country. This therefore made them to mobilize the peasants for a revolution which broke out in 1789. The system created grievances within the army. The survival of the unpopular and despotic French monarchy depended on the army. However, the French army had a lot of grievances against government. For example, there were unfair promotions within the army where the high ranks. European history, the French Revolution of 1789. The system of government created grounds for comparison between Britain and France. Britain had a good system of government based on constitutional rule and also provided for freedom of worship, among other liberties, which was not the case with France. This comparison by the French men eventually made them to organize a revolution by 1789. The system also created grounds for the philosophers to write articles that criticized the government. For example, the writings of Voltaire criticized the French system of government as unfair and compared it with the good governance that was in England. This inspired the Frenchmen to organize a revolution in 1789. The role of the Catholic Church. By 1789, the Catholic Church as a religious institution had a lot of power and weaknesses in France, and this contributed to the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789 in the following ways. There was no religious tolerance or freedom in France during the ancient regime. It was only the Catholic faith that was allowed to be practiced in France. France had other religions like the Protestants, but the ancient regime had a practice of destroying their temples. This religious intolerance caused discontent between the Catholic Church and other religions, which led to the outbreak of the revolution as the masses demanded for freedom of worship. The Catholic Church had a lot of wealth. For example, the church owned a lot of land in France. On this land, the peasants settled and worked as squatters tenants. As tenants or serfs, they were severely exploited and oppressed by the church leaders, which caused public discontent in France. The Catholic Church used to demand a lot of tax from the peasants for staying on the church land. For example, the peasants had to give 10% of their income to the church's tithe. They also had to give a percentage of their harvest to the clergy. Therefore, the peasants revolted in 1789, demanding for a reduction in the tax burden. The Catholic Church controlled the education system in France. While in control, the Catholic Church denied education, especially to the members of other religions. The peasants in general were also affected because the education system was under the clergy, who were members of the first estate, yet the peasants belonged to the third estate. This situation caused antagonism, which led to the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789. The members of the Catholic Church, especially the upper clergy, led a luxurious life in their cathedrals. This extravagancy of the Catholic Church, together with the fact that the clergy were enjoyed exempted from taxation, yet they were very rich, contributed to the bankruptcy of the French crown by 1789. This eventually led to the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789. The members of the Catholic Church had a lot of political power in France. For example, they took the major government posts in French. In 1789, therefore, the government of Louis Roman XVI was blamed for religious favoritism because the members of other religions were not allowed to participate in the running of the French government. The divisions within the Catholic Church, especially among the church leaders, clergy, caused the French Revolution of 1789. The clergy were divided into the upper and lower clergy. The upper clergy, composed of the bishops and archbishops, and these ones lived a luxurious life in their palaces and at the royal court. However, the local parish priests languished in poverty, and this European history, the French Revolution of 1789. The character of King Louis Roman XVI, 1774–1793. He assumed the throne in 1774. The French Revolution broke out in 1789 during his regime, and he was executed or killed in 1793. Generally, King Louis Roman XVI was weak in character, and this contributed to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution in the following ways. He was an autocratic or despotic king, and therefore all the powers were in his hands. Although France had a parliament known as the Estates General, Louis Roman XVI refused the parliament to meet like the other previous kings had done, to the extent that by 1789 the Estates General had spent 175 years without meeting. This parliament would have provided a solution to the problems of France to avoid a revolution. He denied the Frenchmen their fundamental rights and freedoms. For example, he used to issue letters to Cachet, which were warrants or letters that led to the arrest and imprisonment of his opponents plus innocent Frenchmen without trial. He also never allowed freedom of press, expression and association. This caused discontent in France that eventually sparked off a revolution. In France by 1789, he was very conservative. He opposed any attempt that was aimed at carrying out reforms that would reduce his powers and the status of his regime. For example, he refused to grant constitutional leadership in France for fear of reducing his absolute powers. This also caused discontent among the Frenchmen. He supported the social class system in France. He financed the privileges that were enjoyed by the members of the first and second estates at the royal palace. He refused the removal of privileges, like exemption of taxation, and all this caused the bankruptcy of the French crown by 1789, which annoyed the Frenchmen, hence causing a revolution. As a man of weak character, he was so submissive to his wife, the Queen of France. He allowed the influence of Queen Marie Antoinette in the state affairs. For example, when the financial crisis worsened, he appointed financial advisors like Turgot and Necker, who suggested abolishing of the social classes and that the clergy and nobles should start paying taxes since they were rich. However, on the advice of his wife, who was also conservative, the king dismissed the economists, and this worsened the financial status of France. He involved France in the American War of Independence. Between 1776 and 1783, the people of America fought for their independence against Britain. King Louis Roman XVI sent the French soldiers to assist the Americans because he wanted to revenge on Britain, which had defeated France during the 7 years of 1756–1763. During this war, France spent a lot of money, which contributed to a financial problems crisis that eventually sparked off a revolution in France by 1789. Louis Roman XVI signed a free trade treaty with England in 1786, which was a big miscalculation because it caused economic hardships that eventually caused a revolution. This treaty affected the economy of France because as tax-free goods entered France, the French industries closed since they could not compete with the cheap foreign goods from Britain. The closure of industries led to unemployment, which contributed to the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789. He was neglected the state duties or affairs. He used to spend most of his time in leisure activities, like hunting, while important state matters remained unattended to. This is another demonstration. European history, the French Revolution of 1789. He also had a shy character. For example, he could not chair royal council meetings because he was shy, yet this was supposed to be his duty. He could therefore not measure up to his position of being the King of France, which also made him unpopular. Louis Roman XVI was a stauncher, strong Catholic. He was too Catholic that he could not support changes within the Catholic Church that would have catered for the interest of majority of the Frenchmen. For example, he refused to allow freedom of worship and ownership of land by other Frenchmen, which the Catholic Church had restricted. Such changes within the Catholic Church would also have removed tax burdens from the peasants. This equally made Louis Roman XVI unpopular in France. He failed to solve the problem of famine in France. France had been hit by bad weather, severe winter towards 1789, which resulted into famine, but the government of Louis Roman XVI failed to provide food because it was bankrupt. The hungry mobs gathered in Paris, where they formed a group of people known as the Paris Mob, and they therefore started to organize the French Revolution of 1789. He also had a carefree attitude towards the publications of the critical writers, especially the philosophers. These philosophers wrote and circulated articles that criticized the injustices of the ancient regime. It's these publications that made the masses aware of their rights, which were being abused, hence inspiring them to organize a revolution in 1789. He was responsible for the failure of the Estates General, which sparked off the 1789 French Revolution. In May 1789, Louis Roman XVI called the Estates General on the advice of Necker to solve the financial and other problems in France. All the estates were represented. However, Louis Roman XVI disappointed the peasants when he rejected their proposals like end to feudalism and unfair taxation, among others. They therefore decided to revolt in 1789. The influence of the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was the wife of King Louis Roman XVI. She was an Austrian and two got married in 1770. Before Louis Roman XVI became King of France, Queen Marie Antoinette contributed to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution in the following ways. French people hated her to the extent of organizing a revolution against the government. Because of her Austrian origin, as a foreigner in France, she was always referred to as the Austrian woman, which was a sign of lack of popularity and respect among the Frenchmen. This, therefore, influenced the Frenchmen to organize a revolution in 1789. The Queen lacked the necessary wisdom and the sense of judgment. She got married at a very young age of 16 years. This affected her status and responsibility as a queen in France, which made her unpopular among the Frenchmen. This eventually caused the French Revolution of 1789. The Queen of France distanced herself from the unprivileged class of the peasants who were the majority. This was because she belonged to the royal family in Austria. She was a daughter to Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. She was therefore a great supporter of the privileges enjoyed by the clergy and nobles at the expense of the peasants because of her royal background. This also made her unpopular in France. The Queen was insensitive or unsympathetic to the suffering of the French masses, which angered them. They thought that it was because of her foreign status that she was inconsiderate to their European history. The French Revolution of 1789. The Queen interfered with the political affairs in France. This was so because she was the major advisor of her husband, and the two made a terrible combination for France. For example, she advised the king to dismiss people with good ideas from government, like the two financial controllers, namely Turgot and Necker. The two had suggested abolition of the social classes and their associated privileges so as to solve the problem of bankruptcy. However, the Queen advised her husband to dismiss them, which he did, and this worsened the financial status of France, which eventually contributed to the outbreak of the French Revolution by 1789. The Queen of France was at the center and always surrounded by greedy or selfish persons, especially the clergy and the nobles who had left their provinces and came to live at the royal court. These supporters of the ancient regime used the Queen to protect their privileges, and this caused a conflict between the French masses and their Queen that eventually led to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution. The Queen of France contributed to the bankruptcy of the French treasury, which became a major cause of the revolution by 1789. This is because she was very extravagant and fond to pleasure or luxury, to the extent that half of the national income of France was spent on her. Her husband, committed a lot of money from the state treasury for her expenditure, for example on her horses, clothing and entertainment. This caused discontent among the French masses, which led to the outbreak of the 1789 revolution in France. The Queen of France was a living symbol of the French humiliation in the 7 Years' War. Between 1756 and 1763, a hopeless alliance of Austria and France was decisively defeated by Britain. Consequently, France lost her colonies of India and Canada to Britain. This defeat annoyed the Frenchmen, and it increased their hatred towards Austria and the Austrian woman, which contributed to the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789. The influence of England. As a French neighbour, England provided a practical example of what Frenchmen demanded for. Politically, the English system of government and its institutions were admired by many Frenchmen. By 1789, for example, though England was a monarchy or kingdom like France, the English monarchy was constitutional. It also had a functional parliament. On the other hand, France, which was also a monarchy, was autocratic. Therefore, the Frenchmen revolted, demanding for constitutional rule. In addition, in England the Protestant faith was dominant, but England allowed freedom of worship. On the other hand, the Catholic faith was dominant in France, but France did not allow freedom of worship, and this eventually led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. Economically, in 1763 England defeated France and she lost her colonies of India and Canada. The loss of these colonies, which were sources of wealth like minerals, contributed to the bankruptcy of France, which led to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution. England also signed a free trade treaty known as the Cobden Treaty of 1786 with France. By this treaty, British goods were allowed to enter France without paying taxes. This affected the French economy because the British goods, which were superior, outcompeted the French manufactured products. The French industries therefore closed and there was serious unemployment in France, together with bankruptcy. This economic influence of England contributed to the outbreak of the European history, the French Revolution of 1789. The period 1776 to 1783 witnessed a rebellion of the American British colonies against Britain, demanding for their independence. The French government under King Louis Roman XVI extended financial and military assistance to the Americans because he wanted to revenge against Britain, which had defeated France during the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, by which France had lost her colonies of Canada and India. The French soldiers who went to America, led by General Lafayette, fought bravely together with the Americans and defeated the British. Consequently, the Americans got their independence, leading to the creation of the United States of America, USA. This war had political and economic effects that contributed to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution in the following ways. Politically, the French soldiers who helped to liberate the Americans, like General Lafayette, came back to France with revolutionary and democratic ideas. These French soldiers had assisted the Americans to end the British exploitative and autocratic regime. They discovered that the problems they had helped to liberate the Americans from were the very ones in France. It's therefore not surprising that the former soldiers like Lafayette quickly supported the peasants' stage of revolution in 1789. When the Americans got independence from Britain, they drafted a constitution under the leadership of George Washington. In their constitution, it was stated that all men had a right to enjoy certain fundamental freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of movement, and good governance. These freedoms have been violated by Britain, and in the same way, Louis Roman XVI of France violated the same freedoms. In addition, he was a despot because France had no constitution. Therefore, the people of France used the example of the American War of Independence to stage a revolution demanding for the same fundamental freedoms of man. The war exposed the weak character of King Louis Roman XVI. This is because he was more interested in revenge, and he disregarded the financial problems the war would have on France. The financial cost of the war on France eventually contributed to the unpopularity of Louis Roman XVI, which led to the outbreak of the 1789 revolution. Economically, the war forced King Louis Roman XVI to borrow money from the members of the middle class or bourgeoisie so as to support the French army in America. By 1789, the lenders wanted their money back, but because the state was bankrupt, Louis Roman XVI failed to pay back the money. This group therefore influenced other discontented groups in France to stage a revolution in 1789. The war also contributed to the bankruptcy of the French treasury. This was because France spent a lot of money to transport and maintain the soldiers in America during a war that dragged on for 7 years, yet she gained nothing from it. This bankruptcy increased discontent among the peasants, which forced them to organize a revolution against the ancient regime in 1789. The financial crisis or bankruptcy of the French crown. By 1789, the French treasury was bankrupt with a heavy debt burden. This financial crisis was brought about by corruption or embezzlement of the tax revenue by the tax collectors, as well as the extravagancy of the nobles, clergy, and Marie Antoinette. France also wasted a lot of financial resources in useless expensive wars like 7 Years' War of 1756-1763 and the American War, Independence of 1776-1783. Therefore, by 1789, France was facing a severe financial crisis which European history, the French Revolution of 1789. The financial crisis made the French masses to lose confidence in the existing government, which was bankrupt. This therefore forced them to organize a revolution in order to remove the government and replace it with a responsible government that would save the economy from further decline. It forced the ancient regime to borrow money from the middle-class members in France, which it even failed to pay back by 1789. Once the middle-class members realized that the government was unable to refund their money, they joined the peasants in order to remove the government and replace it with one that would pay back their money. It made the government incapable of providing basic necessities and even running the state enterprises like agriculture, transport, and industry. This resulted into economic problems like inflation, unemployment, and general poverty in France by 1789. These economic hardships forced the masses, especially the peasants who were hardest hit, to stage a revolution in 1789. The financial crisis made the government unable to handle the effects of natural disasters like the severe winter that attacked France in 1781 and 1788 and led to crop failure. This was because the government had no money to stock food from abroad for people and to subsidize basic foodstuffs, like bread. This worsened the problem of famine in France, which forced the hungry people to form a mob in the French capital of Paris that started a revolution on by 1789. The financial crisis forced the ancient regime to impose heavy taxes on the peasants, which they opposed to the extent of staging a revolution. There were direct taxes like the tail tax, which was imposed on land, and the poll tax, which was imposed on the head of the household, among others. The indirect taxes included the salt tax known as gabelle and the corvée tax, which was paid in form of forced labor on public works. Worse still, the ancient regime adopted harsh methods of collecting these taxes, which often involved torture, arrest, imprisonment, and death. This caused resentment among the peasants that eventually sparked off a revolution by 1789. The bankruptcy situation increased the unpopularity of the Queen of France. She, for example, supported the extravagancy at the royal court, and she even advised her husband to dismiss Turgot and Necker, who had proposed abolition of the privileges of the first two estates so as to save France from bankruptcy. She therefore became very unpopular, and the resentment towards her caused a revolution in France by 1789. The bankruptcy also exposed the weak character of Louis Roman XVI. The king failed to support the financial reforms as suggested by Turgot and Necker. He instead supported the privileges of the first and second estates, like tax exemption. He also supported the extravagancy at the court, which caused bankruptcy. This therefore made him very unpopular, which led to the outbreak of a revolution in 1789. The financial crisis also brought the philosopher's work into reality or play. The financial crisis led to the torturing of the peasants by the tax farmers, tax collectors, like the cutting of arms, confiscation of their property, and Rousers would criticize the violation of human rights by the leaders and had suggested for man to be left free to enjoy his rights to life and property, among other rights. The peasants were therefore influenced by the writings of Rousseau to stage a revolution in 1789. It was the financial crisis that led to the summoning or calling of the Estates General on 5 May 1789. When King Louis Roman XVI recalled Necker as financial minister, Necker advised the king to call European history the French Revolution of 1789, the first and second estates, so as to solve the financial problems of France. The members of the Third Estate therefore decided to start a revolution in May 1789. Bad weather, severe winter. Between 1787 and 1788, France was hit by bad weather. Severe winter destroyed the crops, and this led to very poor harvests, and therefore there was terrible famine in France. Crowds of hungry and desperate masses left the rural areas and went to Paris, capital of France, hoping to find food. They went to the palace to see if the king could provide for them. King Louis Roman XVI could not provide food because his government was bankrupt, and to make it worse, the food prices in France were very high, and many people could not find employment because the industries had been closed. Therefore, the hungry people decided to join other discontented people and started a revolution in 1789. The summoning and failure of the Estates General 5 May 1789 This sparked off the French Revolution of 1789. The Estates General had spent 175 years without meeting since 1614 during the reign of King Louis Roman XIII. It was summoned or called on 5 May 1789 to examine grievances or complaints and draw up reforms. The representatives from the three state social classes attended the Estates General. While in the meeting, the representatives of the Third Estate peasants demanded for fair taxation, end of feudalism, equality before the law, and an end to the social classes and their privileges. No one suggested the abolition of the monarchy. They simply wanted reforms in it. King Louis Roman XVI made it very difficult for the peasants who had suggested holding a one-man, one-vote on the grievances that had been advanced to form the agenda of the Estates General. He instead suggested that the voting was to be according to the social classes. He feared that the peasants were to defeat the other members since they were the majority. The Third Estate rejected the idea of the king to vote separately. Louis Roman XVI became furious and ordered for the hall to be closed, which meant that he had suspended the meeting. The Third Estate realized that the king was more interested in retaining the privileged position of the First and Second Estates. This annoyed them, and therefore they decided to start a revolution which marked the beginning of the French Revolution of 1789. Later, Count Maribel and the members of the Third Estate used this chance to declare themselves the National Assembly on 17 June 1789. They invited members from the other states to join them. Questions. To what extent did internal factors contribute to the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789? B. To what extent did the external factors contribute to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution? C. The French Revolution of 1789 was inevitable. Discuss. D. Marie Antoinette was primarily responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789. Discuss. E. The weakness in character of King Louis Roman XVI was primarily responsible for the French Revolution of 1789. Discuss. F. Louis Roman XVI was primarily responsible for the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789. Discuss. G. Why was France faced with a revolution in 1789 and not any other European state yet? Conditions. European history. The French Revolution of 1789. H. It was the rottenness of the French political system that led to the outbreak of the 1789 French Revolution. Discuss. The course of the French Revolution of 1789. The course of the French Revolution has a number of events, and history bases on these events to show that there were fundamental changes in France, and it is true that these changes contributed to the collapse of the ancient regime by 1793. The revolution was peaceful at the start, and no one expected to do away with the kingdom. However, in 1792 France became a republic, and in 1793 Louis Roman XVI and his wife were executed. The main features or events of the course of the French Revolution include the following: the summoning of the Estates General May 1789 and the formation of the National Assembly June 17, 1789. The Tennis Court Oath 20th June 1789. The Royal Session 23rd June 1789. The Fall of the Bastille July 1789. The Declaration of the Rights of Man August September 1789. The March of the Women to Versailles October 1789. The Nationalization of Church Property November 1789 and the Assignats. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy July 1790. The Emergence of Emigres. The Death of Maribel April 1791. The King's Flight to Varennes June 1789. The French Constitution of September 1791. The creation of political parties, political clubs in France. The creation of a republic September 1792. The execution of Louis Roman XVI January 1793. European history. The French Revolution of 1789. Consequently, they declared themselves the National Assembly, and this was to act as the Parliament of France, hence replacing the Estates General. They invited members from other estates to join. Then, they were easily joined by the lower clergy and the lesser nobility, who were equally unhappy about the ancient regime. For example, Count Maribel, one of the revolutionary leaders, belonged to the nobility. The formation of the National Assembly was an important event in the course of the revolution, because it made outstanding achievements for France. For example, it abolished feudal laws and therefore reduced the power of the landlords, who used it to demand a lot of taxes from their tenants. The National Assembly also declared that all Frenchmen were free to enjoy their rights that had been violated by the ancient regime. The National Assembly also laid down new administrative structures in France. For example, the local government was reorganized by the creation of 83 divisions, which were known as departments, and the leaders for each department were elected on merit other than being appointed by the king or on the basis of social status as had been before. The National Assembly also abolished the social classes in France. This was a fundamental change, because France used to have three social classes, of which the clergy and the nobles were more privileged than the peasants who were in the third estate. However, the National Assembly declared that everyone was equal, especially before the law. The Tennis Court Earth, 20th June 1789. On 20th June 1789, the third estate members went to their usual meeting place, but they found the hall closed in preparation for the royal session. The third estate was not given prior notice, and for a moment they were confused. However, after some time they went to a nearby building which served as tennis court and held a meeting, from where they took an oath never to separate until the constitution of the kingdom was established. This oath laid a foundation for the declaration of the rights of man, as well as the establishment of constitutional governance in France in the later years of the Revolution. The royal session, 23 RD June 1789. On 23 June 1789, the king organised a special royal session at Versailles, in which he declared that recent acts of the Third Estate, like declaring themselves the National Assembly, is illegal. He also emphasised the fact that the three estates were to meet separately. After this, the king, the nobility, and clergy left the hall, while the Third Estate deputies or members did not leave. The master of ceremonies reported that the king had asked them to leave immediately. In response, Mirabeau, one of the revolutionary leaders, warned that, "Go tell your master that we are here by the will of the people. We shall not leave unless at the point of the bayonet." Or finally conceded defeat, and on 27 June 1789 he ordered all the three estates to sit as one body. This solved the matter that had been the immediate cause of the revolution, i.e. the sitting arrangement. Fall of the Bastille, 14th July 1789. The mob in Paris became excited, and they organised an uprising in support to the revolution. Louis Roman XVI sent his troops to suppress the riot demonstration. However, the revolutionaries disarmed the European history. The French Revolution of 1789. The destruction of the Bastille caused fundamental changes in the history of France. For example, the prisoners were set free and some of the prison guards were killed by the prisoners. This was important in the history of France because it showed that the royal absolute power had been abolished, i.e. there was to be no more imprisonment without trial as it used to happen during the ancient regime. In addition, the news about the fall of the Bastille spread in France, and this resulted into the destruction of other prisons in the provinces of France. It also led to the formation of a revolutionary army known as the National Guard. This army, which was set up to protect the gains of the French Revolution, was put under the command of General Lafayette. The revolutionaries also went ahead to abolish the white colour flag, which was the flag of the ancient regime, and he replaced it with the tricolour flag, a flag with three colours. This colour became the symbol of the revolution. The three colours represented liberty, equality and fraternity, which were the keywords of the French Revolution of 1789. Following the fall of the Bastille, the nobles and clergy became scared. Those who wanted to save their lives and those of their families, and also to save their property from being confiscated or destroyed, surrendered their social status, and they joined the revolution. Therefore, this shows that more changes were being brought about by the revolution in France. The event, however, led to increased violence in France. The former prisoners became violent, and the homes of the nobles and clergy were attacked. The nobles were killed while their property was destroyed. It also led to the first immigration of the nobles who were opposed to the revolution to Austria and Prussia. These nobles were called émigrés. This eventually led to foreign intervention in France and war with Europe. Despite this, however, the fall of the Bastille was an important event in the history of France, to the extent that 14th July became a day for national celebrations up to the present day. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, August-September 1789. This document was drafted by Lafayette and passed by the National Assembly. It outlined the basic rights of man in a free and just society. In summary, the document provided for freedom of man from all forms of oppression or suffering. This document declared that there should be equality for all, freedom of worship, association and speech among others. Consequently, the ancient regime, which was known to be violating such freedoms, could no longer do it, thus another significant change. However, Louis Roman XVI refused to endorse this document, and this action annoyed the revolutionaries. That the king was not interested in the changes that affected his regime. Besides, the declaration emphasized rights and not duties of man, and it was partly due to such weaknesses that the revolution turned more violent. The march of the women from Paris to Versailles, October 1789. In October 1789, about 7,000 hungry and desperate women decided to march from Paris to for a cell where the king and his family lived. They went to demand for food from the king and also to force the king to attend to their needs. General Lafayette, who was in command of the national European history of the French Revolution of 1789. On 6 October 1789, in a very humiliating procession, the women forced the king and the royal family to walk from Versailles to the centre of Paris, which was a distance of 10 kilometers. This clearly indicated that the king had lost all the pride and powers that he had and that the regime was in the hands of the revolutionaries. They went ahead and put him in one of the small palaces in the city Paris and guarded him as a prisoner. The nationalization of church property and the assignats, November 1789. The National Assembly dealt with the Roman Catholic Church in France. With the strong support of Mirabeau, the church estates or properties were nationalized in order to raise state revenue. The state was in a persistent financial crisis following the abolition of all taxes by the National Assembly. The properties were then put on public auction for whoever was interested to buy. Before the sale of these properties was implemented, a new paper currency called assignats was printed to act as security. One assignat was equivalent to 100 francs in 1790. The peasants who now managed to buy these properties, especially land, were very happy with the move, and therefore they became strong supporters of the revolution. The church, however, lost its original influence in the political affairs of France. Some clergy who lost their great estates and wealth were unhappy with the revolution, and they began to collaborate with the anti-revolutionary forces abroad. In addition, as the revolution progressed, the assignats were issued with little reference to the actual value of the church lands. As a result, the assignats rapidly lost value, which led to inflation. One assignat which was worth 100 francs in 1790 was worth 1 franc in 1797. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy, July 1790. In July 1790, the Roman Catholic Church, which was one of the major causes of the revolution, suffered another setback. A document that reduced its power and regulated the behaviors of the clergy, known as the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, was established by the National Assembly. By this document, the revolutionary government took over the responsibility of appointing archbishops, bishops, and priests. It was also the government to pay salaries to the clergy. All the land of the clergy and church where the peasants settled as quarters was taken by the state. This document is another evidence of how the revolution affected the Catholic Church, which used to have a lot of powers and wealth in France. However, the Catholic Church leaders, Louis Roman XVI himself and above all the Pope in Italy, opposed this document. Louis Roman XVI refused to endorse the document, and instead he sought for military assistance from abroad to fight the revolution. Similarly, the predominantly Catholic areas of Montauban, La Vendée and Lyons rebelled against the revolutionary government in France, which led to violence in the country. The emergence of the émigrés. As the revolution progressed, some royalist clergy and nobles who did not want to surrender their social status and were also scared of their lives fled France and went to exile. They were referred to as émigrés, immigrants. They went to Austria and Prussia, and while in these countries, the émigrés persuaded their host countries to support them in an armed struggle to fight the revolutionaries in France and restore the ancient regime in full status. European history, the French Revolution of 1789. Members which was done. This action brought more problems to the surviving members of the ancient regime who lived in France, as the revolutionaries started to arrest and kill those they suspected to be collaborating with those who lived in exile. This therefore caused violence in France. The death of Mirabeau, April 1791. Count Mirabeau had served as the president of the National Assembly from 1789 when the revolution started in France. He desired peaceful revolution where the monarchy had to be preserved, but the monarchy could also accept fundamental changes in France. In April 1791, Mirabeau died. However, his death created a vacuum for ruthless or harsh leaders like Robespierre and Danton to take over the control of the revolution. While these leaders were in control, the revolution became violent and France was declared a republic, and the king was executed in 1793, which led to the collapse of the ancient regime. The King's Fight to Varennes, June 1791. In 1791, King Louis Roman XVI, who was scared that the revolutionaries would kill him, escaped from Paris. Together with his wife, they moved towards the state of Luxembourg, from where he thought they would cross to Austria. He disguised himself as a lady in dressing, but the royal couple was recognized before they could cross the border town of Varennes. They were arrested and taken back to Paris, imprisoned, and were labeled as traitors to the revolution. The revolutionaries went ahead and searched the office of Louis Roman XVI and found documents that showed that the king was collaborating with the émigrés to fight the revolution. These very Documents increased the hostility and resentment of the Frenchman towards the ancient regime, and they were used as evidence that led to his execution in 1793, which marked the end of the ancient regime. The imprisonment of the king also meant that the ancient regime was no longer in control of France. The establishment of the French Constitution, September 1791. In September 1791, the revolutionaries, with the help of the National Assembly, produced a constitution for France. This constitution, among other things, reduced the powers of the monarchy. For example, the king could no longer appoint senior officers in the army and civil servants without the approval of the Assembly. The constitution further recognized the new administrative structures 83, which were referred to as departments and were led by officials known as prefects and sub-prefects. The constitution also provided for the creation of a new assembly called the Legislative Assembly, which was dominated by those who used to be called peasants. The constitution therefore reduced the powers of the monarchy and improved the administration in France. The Legislative Assembly was in power between September 1791 and September 1792. It was succeeded by the Convention government, which governed France from 1792 to 1794. The Legislative Assembly and the Convention government consisted of inexperienced but ambitious politicians who competed with each other so as to fill the vacuum left by the prisoner king and the death of Marat. They included Maximilien Robespierre, Danton, Marat, Harbut, and Roland. They belonged to different political parties and had divergent political opinions. Consequently, the two new governments plunged France into the reign of terror and war with the rest of Europe. European history. The French Revolution of 1789. The emergence of political clubs, parties in France. Three main political clubs or parties were formed in the course of the French Revolution. These clubs had different and rival political interests, and their competition led to violence. The first political party to be formed was that of the Jacobins, and they opened up many branches in parts of France. Their leader was known as Robespierre. The Jacobins wanted force to apply so as to see that the revolution succeeded. They also wanted to turn France into a republic. They, however, feared war with other countries because it would destroy the gains of the revolution. The second political party was the Cordeliers, which represented the views of Lafayette, and it was led by Danton. They greatly supported the constitution for France and they believed in democracy. However, they were not well organized and therefore they soon lost their influence to the Jacobins. Club. The third were the Girondins, formed and led by Roland and his wife Madame Roland. They wanted a republic and favored war with other countries, and indeed they put pressure on the king to appoint Roland as a war minister. The formation of political parties was another event responsible for the establishment of the First French Republic in 1792 and the collapse of the ancient regime. Also, the conflicts and power struggle associated with the political clubs led to more violence in France. France becomes a republic, September 1792. In September 1792, the Convention government led by Robespierre drafted a constitution which declared that France was a republic and not a monarchy. In the constitution, the king had no place, and that France had to elect its leaders. Robespierre became the leader of the Republic of France, and this was another fundamental change that affected the ancient regime and led to its collapse. By 1793, the execution of King Louis Roman XVI, January 1793. In January 1793, the Republican Convention government organized the trial of King Louis Roman XVI. He was charged for treason. They used the evidence of the correspondences with the émigrés they had found in his office following his abortive or failed attempt to escape from France in June 1791. On 21st January 1793, he was sentenced to death using the invented human killing machine which was known as the guillotine. His execution marked the end of monarchical rule in France for some time. The formation of the revolutionary committees. In 1793, the Convention government set up 3 committees to spearhead the success of the revolution. These committees were the Committee of Public Safety. The work of this committee was to spy on the activities of the Revolutionary Army, arrest the suspected opponents to the revolution and send them to the guillotine. The Committee of General Security. This was in charge of the work of the police in Paris and other provinces of France. The members. European history. The French Revolution of 1789. The Revolutionary Tribunal. This was a revolutionary court specifically created to try those brought to it by the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security as offenders to the revolutionary government. Thousands of Frenchmen were brought to this court where appealing was never allowed, and so they were executed. The creation of these committees weakened the ancient regime and led to terror in France. Reasons why the ancient regime collapsed by 1793. The weaknesses of Louis Roman XVI, i.e. his inconsistence, extravagancy, etc. The nature of the ancient regime, i.e. it was characterized by conservatism, nepotism and gross abuse of human rights. The negative rule/character of Queen Marie Antoinette. Failure of Louis Roman XVI to hijack the revolution. The rise of the National Assembly. Declaration of the Rights of Man. The civil constitution of the clergy. Fall of the Bastille. The death of Mirabeau. The enactment of the first French constitution on 5 September 1791. The rise of political parties/clubs, Girondins, Cordeliers and Jacobins weakened monarchy. The hostility of European monarchs towards the French Revolution made the revolutionaries violent towards the ancient regime, e.g. the Pillnitz Declaration and the Brunswick Manifesto. The rise of the Convention government in France and the formation of the Republic in 1792. The rise of the Paris mob/mob justice. The rise of personalities like Danton, Robespierre. The King's flight to Varennes leading to his execution. The American War of Independence. Failure of the army to support the monarchy. Rule of England. European history. The French Revolution of 1789.